you are somebody who is actually struggling with gut issues, chronic bloating, if you try to do a lot of the approaches that are geared towards gut health, it can actually exacerbate a lot of the symptoms. So for gut health in particular, and what maybe causes the gut to be off, high sugar diet, for sure.
All 8 billion of us are doing metabolism at all times. This show is about learning what metabolism is, how it affects you in every way possible, from mood and mental state to performance and energy. We are all about fine-tuning the human experience for you to achieve the best self you can be. And if you are someone who loves science, curious to know how your body works and how to optimize it, then you are in the right place. This is the H.V.M.N Podcast. In this episode, we have Rachel Scheer, who is a certified functional medicine nutritionist, entrepreneur, and highly sought-after speaker with a passion for gut health and healing. Her unique approach to health and healing has helped thousands of people overcome their health challenges by taking a root cause approach. Rachel has also built a fully organic multi-million-dollar business and speaks at various events and conferences on entrepreneurship, the power of your story, healing, abundance, and her expertise in functional medicine and gut health. In this episode, we discussed everything gut health, differences between gut health and gut healing, the science behind gut-brain axis, and the different types of food that you should avoid or take for better gut health. So stay tuned and enjoy this episode. We have Rachel Scheer here. Thank you for coming on to Health via Modern Nutrition Podcast. Recently, you interviewed me on your podcast, and now I have the honor to interview you on the H.V.M.N Podcast. Welcome.
Dr. Latt, thank you for having me on your show today, and it's great to see you again. I'm excited to nerd out after we dove into all things ketones and metabolism last time.
Yes, we talked about ketones and metabolism. Now let's switch gears to your expertise, which is, gut health, functional medicine, and, get a few tips and advice from you to even being a successful speaker, being a confident person that you are, and looking as good as you are. I'm sure our audience would love to hear, what you have to say on what they can do in their daily lives to really follow your footsteps. Let's start on telling the audience what your background is and what you do.
I'm a functional medicine dietitian. Functional medicine just basically means root cause. So with my nutrition practice, I'm all about doing extensive testing, looking at the gut microbiome, hormones, thyroid, adrenals, and identifying not only what is off, but I ask the question why. Why do we have a problem in the first place? And what can we do to restore function? So, Western medicine, I always say, is really the science of what. It's great, we need it. But when it comes to a lot of these chronic health conditions that people are struggling with, like IBS, autoimmune conditions, anxiety, depression, diabetes, metabolic issues, it really often comes down to a lot of these lifestyle factors that are really overlooked with Western medicine. And I even think often too in our healthcare system, we give a lot of trash can diagnoses. This is a term that I use quite a bit, but trash can diagnoses are simply diagnosing just based off of symptom clusters. So, for me, I struggled a lot with gut issues, actually at the peak of competing in bodybuilding. And from the outside looking like the epitome of health, but on the inside, I had, chronic bloating, and I had hormonal imbalances, and I had low thyroid, and I had all these health issues, and did all of the testing with Western medicine, colonoscopy, endoscopy, CT scan, MRI, and I just was given a label of IBS, or irritable bowel syndrome, which is kind of funny because it's like, yes, I know, my gut, it's irritable. Where they gave me that diagnosis because they really couldn't figure out what was off or what was really going on. Structurally, everything was fine. And I just fit the criteria for IBS based off of the symptoms. And, I see this happen a lot, whether it's with IBS, depression, we diagnose based off of symptom clusters. I see this with people who suffer with hormonal imbalances like PCOS. That's a very common female hormone imbalance. And the approach is really more symptomatic instead of actually truly helping people heal. So coming back full circle, I'm really just a huge advocate for helping people take more ownership in creating the healing that they really want so they can live the health and the life they want for themselves.
Amazing. What even inspired you to start this path of your career? Like, what inspired you to start bodybuilding? Was it because of the dysfunction that you went through during bodybuilding that sparked this interest, or have you always had this interest?
Yeah, I've always been an athlete for sure. Like, I've considered myself as part of my identity to be an athlete. I grew up as a gymnast and a dancer. I actually remember a few years ago, it really dawned on me how much it was a part of my identity when a guy was like, "How do you stay so fit all the time? Like, I watch you and like your body has never changed." And I was like, he's like, "How long have you been working out for?" And I was like, "Well, how long have I been working out for?" So I'm like trying to count how many years. And I'm like, well, when I was a kid, I was a gymnast. When I was like 5, and then I was a dancer. And I was like, I don't know, I'm an athlete. And it was interesting because in that moment, I realized that, part of what he was asking is like, how long have you been working out? Like something you do. And I really thought of it from the perspective of this is who I am. So, health and fitness has just been a part of who I am for my entire life. And that's why I decided to go to Baylor and study nutrition science and dietetics, because I was interested in athletic performance. I actually grew up eating like shit food as a kid. I hope I can cuss on here. I don't know. But I grew up eating like candy bars and McDonald's because I just didn't have the best upbringing. I didn't know anything about nutrition. And I was like, maybe if I just started to learn a bit more about nutrition, this would help me in athletics. And when I went off to college, I no longer was a dancer or gymnast, but I picked up weightlifting and bodybuilding. And I fell in love with it, just like I fell in love with dance and gymnastics. I loved what it did for my body physically, the confidence that it created, not only like physically and how my body looked, but mentally, right? There's something about just like pushing my body to it's extreme, really, and like seeing what I was capable of, the power behind it all, and pushing through these limits. I fell in love with what it did for me mentally and physically. And I watched my body change and transform in ways that, dance and gymnastics didn't really do. And that was when I started to get into competing in bodybuilding. And I was winning. Like pretty much every show. Yeah, like right off the bat. And I'm like, okay, there's something to this. I'm really good at this. So I competed for 3 years back to back. I was at 10% body fat, incredibly lean for a female, actually not a healthy percent body fat for a woman to maintain, but I looked awesome. I had 8-pack abs, and that's all I really cared about at that time in my life. And that was a big definition of...
Hey, nowadays, that is the entire identity of a person.
Right? Yeah, I mean, it was my identity truly, and I'll even go deeper into that. But, I looked from the outside like the epitome of health. I had grown my social media through fitness modeling. I did a bunch of different magazine covers, Men's Health, bodybuilding.com. And, for me, though, health was really just about the physical side, though. Yes, I cared about muscle, and muscle is important when it comes to the overall arching picture of health, metabolic health, but I wasn't doing it for that reason. I was doing it because, I wanted to look good naked, and I wanted to look good in a bikini, and I wanted to feel as confident as possible. And therefore, I ended up actually pushing my body to very extreme levels when it comes to fitness. And it was at that point, 3 years into competing, where I actually started to get sick, and I started to struggle with hormonal imbalances. I started to struggle with hypothyroidism. I didn't have a menstrual cycle. I was struggling with anxiety, a bit of depression, and a lot of gut issues. And honestly, I was like, all right, I'll get on thyroid medication, sure. Like the hypothyroidism, I'll take birth control. even get on an antidepressant. But the one that I really couldn't just like numb and take a pill for was all of my gut issues. So bloated, looked probably 6 months pregnant at the end of every single day. And that's when I turned to Western medicine to help figure out what was going on. Because, you know, when you're in it too, it's really hard to sometimes see what is so obvious, like right in front of you, like hindsight now looking back, especially as I've become certified in functional medicine and I do the work that I do, I'm able to look and be like, well, no shit, reason why, like everything became off, like metabolically, like where you were at, like percent body fat, like the thyroid begins to slow down, is just like a feedback, and then your hormones begin to decline. But it was like, nobody really actually looked at me as like a person. I felt like they just looked at the numbers and then tried to treat the numbers. And all it really would have taken is somebody to take the attention and care to really get to know me, what was going on in my life, what I was doing with my activity levels, what my diet looked like, you know, very low calorie diets. Yes, I was getting enough protein. You know, my macros were on point from a body composition standpoint, but, you know, I was really in a very catabolic state. Catabolic meaning a breakdown state. And, you know, now describing what really happened in my body and led to, you know, all my health issues and almost having my entire large intestine removed because I could no longer use the restroom at all because my motility in my gut actually completely came to a halt, where I had to even use an enema to go to the restroom at all, prescription laxatives and all of that. Their solution was, you know, hey, let's cut out the large intestine. We'll do a colectomy, so your small intestine to the rectum, and this will fix a lot of the motility issues because we'll shorten that that transit time there. They thought maybe it was something structurally I'd had for most of my life, something called a floppy colon. But, you know, it was in that place where I was at that I really started to kind of pivot and do a lot of the deep inner work on myself, emotionally, but also to, you know, I wanted a different approach. You know, I was at that point where I was numbing. I was on all these different medications. I was following the system. And don't get me wrong, I really do think there's some incredible Western medicine physicians out there. Like, we need them 100%. But when it came to my core issues, I wasn't getting the help. I even went to the Mayo Clinic, like the best place in the United States when it comes to healthcare. And, you know, I started to just really become obsessed with learning everything that I could about gut health, because for me it was really like, remove your large intestine or fix these issues. And I was at a point where I was ready to actually get the surgery. I remember actually being like, just schedule the surgery, just take it out. Like I was that like fed up. So I also can speak to people now in the work that I do. And I think this is what also makes me so good in my work and how my practice has been so successful, is because I truly know what it's like. I know what it's like for somebody to be at that point, to be suffering, to be fed up, to be frustrated, to feel like nobody's really there that's helping them, to like just want to take the medication, just want to do the quick fix. Like, I can connect and relate to that on such a deep level and have so much empathy for that person, but also offer them a solution in another way for them to truly heal and take ownership over their health. And it's definitely not the easy path. It's not the quick fix path. It requires a lot more work, but it's definitely worth it. And actually, as I began to do a lot of this work, I realized that so much of my issues were actually coming from my gut. Now, we could say the root cause was that I had a lot of dysbiosis in my gut, which is an imbalance of bacteria. I actually was diagnosed with SIBO, small intestinal bacteria overgrowth, intestinal permeability, leaky gut. Yes, that all makes sense where the motility slowed down, and it led to the constipation and the bloating and all of those issues. But I like to ask the question, what caused that? What caused that? Because that's really the true root cause. And even Western medicine didn't even look at it from the standpoint of like I had SIBO. They weren't even really talking about SIBO at the time. Like it was something that was very new in medicine. It was like very early on in the research. So even that, like figuring that out was huge. So I started doing, the SIBO protocols, different rounds of antibiotics, different antimicrobial protocols, herbal protocols, and I'd relapse and I would relapse. I was doing very restrictive diets, low FODMAP diets, specific carbohydrate diets, even one time really going basically like minimal carbohydrate just because of all of the bacteria in our gut, like fermenting on all of these carbohydrates and producing so much of the gas and the bloating. But when I was really able to look at everything that was going on, for me, the true root cause was really coming from, where I was at, yes, metabolically, but there was multiple different stressors that were happening. There was dietary stressors. And one thing I talk about with my practice is there's 4 main stressors that really cause dis-ease in the body: dietary stress, physical stress, environmental stress, and then, hidden inflammation too. So dietary stress for me, I was in a very low calorie diet metabolically. So I had not a whole lot of nutrition that was coming in. And what the body does in defense is it slows everything down. It metabolically slows down our thyroid. Cortisol begins to increase, which cortisol is very catabolic, and it's not problematic in short spurts, but it's problematic, right, when it's chronically elevated. And that cortisol breaks things down. When we're bodybuilding, we want to avoid cortisol as much as possible because we're like, well, we want to maintain our muscle, and it breaks down our muscle tissue. But we don't think about often that, our gut is also very interconnected with our adrenals. So every time, my cortisol was chronically elevated, which was a lot because I was very prone to low blood sugar drops with how lean I was, my entire gut would shut down. Not to mention that cortisol also can break down the gut lining because it is very catabolic, leading to leaky gut, intestinal permeability. And then my diet too also was full of a lot more, I'd like to say like diet foods, artificial sweeteners, fillers, all like the bodybuilder foods like pre-workouts and post-workouts, full of gums and fillers. Nothing you would look at normally and be like, this is bad. But combined with a lot of the stress, metabolically, everything really slowing down, the motility in my gut slowing, the breakdown of my gut lining, along with some of the emotional stress and physical stress from overtraining, this created this perfect terrain for bacteria to overgrow, feed off of a lot of these fermentable carbohydrates in my diet, and really lead to the byproduct of SIBO. So I share all of that because, really realizing this was the beginning of my healing journey. When I was able to identify, it wasn't just one thing. It wasn't just the SIBO. It wasn't just the dysbiosis in my gut, but it was really my lifestyle, right? Kind of going back to that, what I mentioned earlier, was my lifestyle. It was my nutrition, and it was my relationship that I had with myself. Even
It's also looking at metabolism as a whole big picture, that all these factors contribute to it rather than singling out, like you said, just the numbers, the biomarkers, the the blood parameters. And it's interesting you mentioned that you struggled with depression as well, because from the outside in, I'm sure a lot of people look at you, you're successful, you're winning this competition, you look amazing. It's like, surely she's like the model human being there is. Why would she be depressed? And a lot of people don't know what's going on inside. So that's definitely a point there as well. And you were saying you were so close to having that surgery of removing your large intestines. What made you turn around? Like, I know you said, you went through that functional medicine and trying out fixing all your gut issues and whatnot, but what was the click? What was the turning point? Because you were so determined already, right?
I've always been very determined in anything that I do. Like you could say I'm like very perfectionistic, but when I get on something, I get on something. So there's always been like the positive side, but the negative side. So like right when I got onto like fitness and bodybuilding, like I'm laser focused. Part of why my business has been so successful. And then that kind of same mindset just kind of clicked. It's hard to say what the exact moment was, but I just started to become obsessed with learning about gut health. And I think too, when it's your own health, right? Like I probably would never have like spent hours and hours in the evening times, like researching and learning about like gut bacteria and the microbiome and SIBO and all of these issues. Like I wouldn't have. But when it's your own
You're more
stuff, like
invested.
you're really invested. So I think, I don't know if it was a moment, but it was just curiosity that slowly built. And then like being like, okay, no one's trying this. Nobody's doing this. And then really just, fully investing into my healing. And I didn't do it all on my own. I ended up working with some different, functional practitioners along the way, which also helped me quite a bit too. But at the end of the day, I had to be the one who was like, I am going to heal. I'm going to heal, and that nobody can do the work for me. And so one thing I even speak to a lot with clients and people who are even interested in working with us is like, your coach, your practitioner, or whoever you work with on your healing journey. And I believe in like having a team, for different things too, because it's not on one person to do all of it, but they're really there to be a guide in a lot of ways. Like they're there to help guide you, do the testing, give you the information that you need, maybe help create protocols. But we have to be the one who takes ownership and says, I want this, and I'm going to do what it takes to heal. And I think so once I had that mindset and combine that with, doing a lot of these functional medicine protocols and a lot of the deep healing work, because that part's important too. Something I talk a lot about is, especially with depression, right? So the gut and the brain are very interconnected. And when our gut is off, this is going to massively impact our mental health. But on the opposite side too, if we're not dealing with our mental health, if we're not dealing with our, past trauma and the relationship that we have with ourselves, this is also going to massively impact our gut health. It's not a coincidence that most people who have IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, autoimmune conditions also have a history of unaddressed trauma that they're also struggling with too.
This is great conversation. And I was just about to ask, what are the latest science around gut health that you've read and you've followed that you would like to share before we go into the gut brain axis? Because I want to ask more questions around that. So yeah, please share with us what are the most exciting new findings in gut health and how it affects our overall metabolic health.
You say mental health or metabolic health?
Metabolic health.
Metabolic health, there's so many different ways, right, about how the gut impacts our metabolic health, because the gut is really connected to all these different systems. Our gut's going to influence our hormones like estrogen. Estrogen is actually metabolized through the gut. So it's also not uncommon when a woman, has bacteria overgrowth in her gut, or she's constipated too, that she's also estrogen dominant, because we actually have to deactivate estrogen through the liver, eliminate it through the gut. Testosterone too. There was a study published in the Journal of Gut Microbes that found that actually probiotic supplements in women with polycystic ovarian syndrome, PCOS, led to a decrease in circulating androgens like testosterone, and even an improvement in insulin resistance and menstrual cycle regularity, all because of the gut bacteria that she had influencing her hormones, insulin. There's also some really great studies that really dive into more so metabolically how these gut bacteria also play a role in insulin sensitivity, as well as more so body weight composition. Like one test that we do quite a bit at Rachel Scheer Nutrition is we run a gut microbiome test on all of our clients, because we're just addressing gut health. And there's two types of phylum that we see in the gut, Firmicutes and Bacteroidetes. I never know if I'm saying that second one correct, Bacteroidetes. People say Bacteroidetes. But what's super interesting is there's some research around when people have a high F-B ratio, so ratio of Firmicutes to Bacteroidetes, that it's actually connected to obesity and a higher body composition. And they were able to figure this out by actually extracting some of the gut bacteria from obese mice and injecting that into lean mice, so mice that were at a healthy body composition, and seeing that the bacteria caused the lean mice to actually gain weight metabolically. So some really interesting research there. I truly think metabolically we've really overlooked the power that our gut microbiome really plays. It's interesting to also consider too, it's like what came first though, the chicken or the egg, right? Because our lifestyle, our diet, the foods that we eat plays such a huge role in our microbiome. We also know, if you were breastfed, if you were born via C-section, genetically, those also can play a big role in your gut biome. But we also can't ignore the fact that these bacteria are influencing all of these systems. So there is the metabolic system and how that plays a role in fat loss and insulin. There's even certain gut bacteria that produce these metabolites. So they're called short-chain fatty acids, something called butyrate. And they've shown that butyrate even improves insulin sensitivity in glucose metabolism. So meaning if you have a lot of probiotics, bifidobacterium and lactobacillus, this is going to improve your glucose metabolism and how well you tolerate carbohydrates. So I think we're still kind of relatively early on in the research, and the same thing even goes with like the gut-brain connection too. Like something I'm super interested in learning about right now is psychobiotics.
Okay, what are those? Tell us more.
Yeah, so psychobiotics are a type of probiotic that has been shown to work like an antidepressant. And usually they're strains of lactobacillus and bifidobacterium. They can produce more of a psychotropic effect on behavior, affecting the HPA axis, so our hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenals, and therefore influencing a lot of the neurotransmitters in the brain, so impacting serotonin levels. And I think there was even a study cited by John F. Chiran, and he studied two varieties of bifidobacterium, and he actually found that it was more effective than Lexapro, which is actually the antidepressant that I was on, which is an SSRI selective reuptake serotonin inhibitor. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, I think so. But
Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor.
But I was about to say depression because I know that for depression there is a dysfunction in the HPA axis where there is also a huge release of cortisol that is constantly elevated that is causing that sort of mental disorder as well. So please continue. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's what's super fascinating is like the role that a lot of these psychobiotics can have, and especially working just as good as a lot of the standard antidepressants that are used. But I also think too, like we often overlook like what all goes into depression. And it's not just low serotonin always. And even sometimes too, I think people are mistaken when we think about the gut-brain connection. So like the bacteria in our gut do produce most of our serotonin. 90% of it is actually produced from the gut microbes in our gut. However, this is where a lot of people get it confused. That serotonin doesn't actually cross through our blood-brain barrier. Because if that much serotonin did, this would actually lead to similar effects like LSD. So basically we'd be like all tripping all the time, based off of like our gut bacteria if it crossed through the blood-brain barrier. But what it does is it actually stimulates our body's vagus nerve, because neurons that fire together actually fire other neurons around them. So when we have a lot of serotonin that's produced in the gut, it's stimulating our body's vagus nerve. And that vagus nerve, also known as the wandering nerve, which connects our gut all the way to our brain, and then also connects it to our heart and a lot of other different body organs, is so important for our body's parasympathetic response. So often when we see people who have anxiety, unaddressed trauma, depression, what they're actually really struggling with quite a bit is they're struggling with low vagal tone. They're struggling with, they're stuck in more of a sympathetic state, more of a fight or flight state, which actually causes the gut to completely shut down, rendering more of the vagus nerve not active and not firing. And this is what can actually lead to not only a lot of these mental health issues, anxiety, depression is a byproduct of being in the sympathetic state, cortisol elevated, neurotransmitter downregulation of serotonin, but it can also negatively influence our gut. And that's why, it really is this bi-directional communication between our gut and our brain.
It's amazing. I was about to ask, that was one of the questions I have listed actually, to explain the gut and brain axis, and you explained it perfectly and very well. And I learned something new today too, because, opposed to many people's opinion, just because you got a PhD doesn't mean that you know everything about the human body. So in terms of brain health, as we're talking about brain health, it's funny because this week's H.V.M.N Podcast episode is with Dr. Tommy Wood. And he's an expert in brain health and brain injury and, recovery, mitigation of damage and all of that. And we talked about different ways we can help with brain aging, and dancing was one of them. And that's why when you said dancing, I was like, what kind of dance did you do?
Kick dance. Like not the relaxing kind of dance. I probably was more in a stress state.
I picked up ballroom and Latin dancing when I was in university, when I was doing my PhD, and then I stopped. And then after that interview, I was like, maybe I should pick it up again, because it's the coordination, the connection, and the stimulation that you need between your eyes, your limbs, your brain, and all of that, and plus the cardiovascular fitness aspect of things as well. But okay, so switching gear back to the science and the gut. So if people want to do those microbiome tests with you, do they have to be where you are, or can they access it online and send samples in and whatnot?
Yeah, so we work with people all over the United States. It's a stool test, so they do it in home. We ship out the kits to them. It's like getting a very small sample because there's trillions and trillions of bacteria in our stool, and we can't test the blood or things like that. There is other type of testing that can be done, but we're really fond of doing either microbiome testing, and if we suspect somebody has SIBO, even doing some breath testing. Microbiome testing isn't very diagnostic for SIBO. However, we can see a lot of patterns with somebody who would have SIBO, certain types of bacteria that maybe are overgrown, that tend to produce more hydrogen gas or methane gas in particular. But I like microbiome testing because it really gives us a good overview of is there low diversity in the gut, which is probably honestly most of the population is struggling with low diversity. So
because we eat the same foods, or
we eat the same foods, but also just our soil is very nutrient void with how we process it. So that plays such a huge role in our gut diversity. So I say just based off of what we do, most people come back with low diversity in their gut, which diversity is super important to metabolic health. There's a lot of connections with type 2 diabetes, autoimmune conditions, Alzheimer's, dementia. So working on improving our gut health is really important for our diversity. But gut health is also very different than gut healing, and I always like to separate the two. So somebody who comes back and maybe has some low diversity, awesome, let's work on gut health. We can do a lot of that with, creating more diversity in our diet. The gut loves prebiotics, which are really insoluble fiber, polyphenols, which is what gives all of fruits its bright colors. Polyphenols actually work a lot like a prebiotic in feeding different gut bacteria, so we can create more diversity by eating a highly colored diet. So like blueberries, green tea. I love matcha green tea.
My favorite.
Chocolate. There's certain supplements, quercetin, resveratrol, turmeric, curcumin, that are also great polyphenols too, that really help actually lower that F-B ratio that I was talking about. That plays a big role in even weight gain that we see, but also acts like a prebiotic. When we eat more of these prebiotics, we feed a lot of these different microbes in our gut, different good bacteria ideally, and they produce more of these short chain fatty acids, these postbiotics. And it's a lot of these postbiotics like butyrate that they've studied that really have a lot of the benefit metabolically in our bodies.
And when you talked about diversity, is that why restorative or regenerative agriculture is becoming bigger and people are paying more attention to it now?
I think so. Honestly, I haven't dove into probably the research enough to have like a huge opinion on that. But I do think that plays a huge role.
Okay. And then you covered gut health, right? And then you were saying it's different to gut healing. So what is gut healing?
Yeah, so gut healing is when the microbiome or the gastrointestinal tract has become dysfunctional or impaired. And I use that word very lightly, but the gut can become dysfunctional through inflammation, bacteria, dysbiosis. So, meaning we maybe have an overgrowth of, we'd say, quote unquote, bad bacteria, but bacteria that's maybe more inflammatory. So some bacteria produce something called LPS, a lipopolysaccharide, that tend to be more inflammatory to the body. Sometimes we can see gut pathogens too. So like the microbiome test looks for that, which could be like parasites, fungal overgrowths, other type of bad bacteria like I'm blanking, but listeria, C. diff is another type of a gut pathogen. So any of these would be considered to be, the gut is dysfunctional. Sometimes we can see digestive insufficiency too. So this would be low stomach acid, pancreatic insufficiency, low bile flow, which can also play a big role in actually the development of a lot of this dysbiosis or even bacteria overgrowth. So my favorite area, I just love researching, is about SIBO, just because that's what I had. And I just think it's such an interesting subject, because it's not just like, okay, treat the bacteria, but it's like, okay, what is the type of gases the bacteria are producing? What caused the SIBO? And there's really, 3 big root causes when it comes to SIBO. One is typically digestive insufficiency, so low stomach acid, low bile flow, pancreatic insufficiency, because if we're not producing these enzymes, we're not breaking down food, but also that stomach acid is really that first line of defense when we take food outside in the world and put it into our body that has a lot of other different types of pathogens and bacteria with it. So it kills off a lot of that. So when we're low in stomach acid, this can also mean we're not really getting a lot of that bacteria to die off in the gut, which can then lead to more small intestinal bacteria overgrowth, which is where we wouldn't want it. The second thing that we see quite a bit is poor motility in the gut. So our body's migrating motor complex. Oftentimes this can be a byproduct of poor vagal tone. So going back to that gut-brain connection, chronic stress is a huge one. I mean, honestly, that's probably one of the biggest one that leads to poor motility. Hypothyroidism can play a pretty big role. There's a lot of different reasons that can lead to the migrating motor complex to be impaired. Actually, it's very common for a lot of bodybuilders to have an impaired migrating motor complex, just because we were constantly eating throughout the day. They were always snacking, and the migrating motor complex really is activated or at its peak activation typically about 3 hours after eating. So we need to be in that fasting state. So most MMC action, these cleaning waves that are sweeping bacteria, foods, and toxins throughout our gastrointestinal tract, so that motility part, really takes place the most, one at night when we're fasting, but in between these meals here. So if we're snacking constantly throughout the day, we're actually impairing our body's migrating motor complex. Which is one reason why I'm not a big believer in, small frequent meals boost your metabolism.
Right. Yeah, I know. I know you posted that recently, and it's like, where do people even get the idea that when you have small meals every few hours, so often throughout the day, increases your metabolism?
I think it came initially from the idea of the thermic effect of food. So if you were eating more frequently throughout the day, it doesn't really make sense. And there's been some good research about it, none that I can cite off the top of my head, but there is some good research about there is a thermic effect of food, definitely. Right? So the thermic effect of protein is a lot higher. So this is also why high protein diets do tend to work a lot better when it comes to fat loss. The thermic effect of food of fats is a lot more minimal. So I can kind of see how people, macronutrient wise would want to make different shifts overall. But they've shown in studies that, there really wasn't any difference between eating, 3 meals throughout the day versus just breaking those up into smaller meals. And if there was a different thermic effect based off of doing so. So
Yeah.
I just
Well,
think
that's
it
interesting. So, sorry, go ahead.
I just was going to say, I think it's more of an opportunity just to overeat. So if you are somebody who's struggling with weight loss, I know for myself, when I like to eat, I like to eat. And it's kind of like a small appetizer where you're like, oh, you only get to eat a little bit, not actually feel full and satisfied. And then you have to wait longer. So behavior wise, I don't think it's ideal. And that's one way why intermittent fasting works, is because it shortens the time frame and the amount of meals. So there's less opportunities to overeat.
And then if you look at from a hormonal point of view as well, there's insulin, there's glucagon, there's a lot of different hormones which are in pulsative sort of pattern, and it needs the time to go up and go back down, and then the storage we sort of go in between the phases of anabolic and catabolic, and you need to let the body do its thing. But if you're constantly snacking and go into this anabolic state, that would throw these other hormones into disarray, because then they're like, when am I being catabolic? When am I actually using it? Am I gonna downregulate metabolism because I am always in abundance of food, and therefore I just need to store them and not have to use them? So there's a whole lot of discussion around that as well. So speaking of SIBO, is there a standard protocol to treat SIBO at the moment, or is it a more of an individualized approach?
There is a standard approach, but there's of course a lot of things that are going to be individualized in that approach for each person, right? So we talked about 2 of the root causes: digestive insufficiency, impaired migrating motor complex. The last one is more so structurally, adhesions, things like that, where there's actual blockages in the GI tract. So really anything that impairs the food moving throughout the gastrointestinal tract tends to be more of a root cause. There can be genetic issues. I actually found out one thing from going to the Mayo Clinic is that I had a genetic defect called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a hypermobility issue. And this actually is a root cause very often in SIBO, because things tend to move around a lot with organs throughout the body. And super interesting is I did this scan when I was doing a lot of this testing very early on with my issues, and my large intestine, when I was laying down, or small intestine, was right where it was supposed to be, and then when I actually stood up, it completely fell to the lower part. And I was like, well, maybe this is because I'm so lean, but I actually came back that I had Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, hypermobility. So that's actually the hardest kind to treat, because they're more prone to relapses quite a bit. So really the treatment protocol when it comes to SIBO is when we do have to identify, what caused the SIBO in the first place. Is it digestive insufficiency? Is it impaired migrating motor complex? Well, what type? Is it stress? Three would be, are there adhesions? Anybody who's had any kind of surgery also in their gut, they're more prone to developing some of these adhesions, genetic disorders, which are very rare. I'm just super lucky. Because if we don't identify that and we just treat, so the standard treatment is typically antibiotics. So the most well-researched protocols is a combination of Xifaxan and neomycin, and that can treat usually a combination of hydrogen and methane type SIBO. But the rate of relapse is really high because a lot of times Western medicine just gives it the antibiotics, and they, one, haven't looked at what caused the SIBO in the first place. And then they also haven't really healed the gut. So oftentimes, too, just because we got rid of a lot of the bacteria overgrowth, it doesn't necessarily mean that the gut is healed, right? Oftentimes there's inflammation, there's still that intestinal permeability. So we actually need to, completely heal the gut, which this whole process can be a year or longer for a lot of people, doing more of an intensive gut healing protocol. There's usually some kind of a SIBO diet somebody needs to follow, temporarily pulling out some of these fermentable carbohydrates that are feeding a lot of the bacteria. However, when we're treating SIBO, we do want to have some fermentable carbohydrates because a lot of studies have shown that when the bacteria is actually being fed and a bit more active, it's easier to treat with antibiotics or antimicrobials, which are a more natural type of an antibiotic, oil of oregano, berberine. And then after somebody's been treated, usually there's about a good, I'd say 6 months at least, of some kind of a prokinetic. So prokinetic is something that's going to help with the motility side. So in medicine, oftentimes they'll use low dose erythromycin, 50 milligrams of that. There's also a lot of other different more natural options. Artichoke is actually a great motility agent. Ginger is an awesome motility agent. So 1,000 milligrams of ginger, artichoke. Typically there's some kind of a combination taken intermittently throughout the day or a larger dose before bed can just help stimulate that body's migrating motor complex to keep those cleaning waves activated. So all in all, like overarching, there's always some kind of a diet addressing what the root cause was and making sure we treat that. There's the active treatment, which can be antibiotics. Other options can be herbal antimicrobials. Actually, one of my more recent favorite options is an elemental diet. Just very difficult for a lot of people to follow because you're really just only eating MCT oil, pure glucose. Sometimes they use honey, and then amino acids for 2 weeks straight. And I know when I had SIBO, there wasn't a lot of pre-made type good tasting options out there. So I was kind of make it homemade, super gross. So I was I do not want to do that option. But the elemental diet has actually been shown to be one of the most effective ways for treating SIBO. It actually eradicates it, I think, in up to 70% of cases, where typically with the standard dose of Xifaxan and neomycin, it's normally around 55% or so, without there being a relapse overall. So treatment and then some kind of a motility agent. And as long as the person really makes a lot of lifestyle changes too that they can maintain after, we can usually avoid relapse. But if somebody continuously is relapsing, time and time again, it's okay, did we really get to the root issue? Is there a motility issue, an adhesion issue? And sometimes there's a need for more of an aggressive approach. Also, depending on the type of gas that's produced, hydrogen, methane, sulfur, and then there can also be fungal overgrowth. So the treatments are a little bit different depending on all of those things.
But ultimately, consistency is key, right? Even after you fix it.
Yeah, consistency is the key. Yeah, I've had to do a few SIBO protocols on myself.
Now I'm really curious about myself, actually. I'm because I've never done such tests before. I've never really looked at my own microbiome. I think growing up in Malaysia, it wasn't a thing, microbiome or gut health wasn't a thing. I mean, even here, it's relatively new, as you said. Even the research is relatively new, and even connecting the gut-brain axis and looking at the different hormones affecting mental health and having an impact in the gut itself, it's very, very new. So, yeah, I'm definitely very interested. So I will be following up with you on that. Um, Talking about types of food, this is one of the favorite questions. You know, a lot of audience always like this. What specific foods that people should avoid or should be encouraged to take for gut health?
We'll start with foods to avoid for gut health. And I'll say gut health, right? Because when we're talking about gut healing, it's typically a lot more of a restricted diet. Most of what people see online on social media is talking about gut health, right? Do the prebiotics, the probiotics, all these kind of stuff. But if you are somebody who is actually struggling with gut issues, chronic bloating, if you try to do a lot of the approaches that are geared towards gut health, it can actually exacerbate a lot of the symptoms. So for gut health in particular, and what maybe causes the gut to be off, high sugar diet for sure. Because the sugar is really what's going to feed a lot of the microbes in our gut. Especially yeast love sugar in particular. So typically somebody who has a really high carbohydrate diet, high sugar diet, they're more prone to develop SIBO, small intestinal fungal overgrowth. So sugar is a big one. Artificial sweeteners. And there's a lot of back and forth about artificial sweeteners. I've gotten in some arguments with different people because a lot of the research is based more in mice when they are researching the effects of artificial sweeteners and on the alteration of the gut microbiome. So, I can't really speak to like, okay, this is not done on people and done on mice. However, I do know with myself and with, the thousands of clients that we've worked with, most people do see a decrease in their gut symptoms and bloating when we do pull out artificial sweeteners. Yeah, monk fruit is okay. Usually stevia is okay as long as it's not like the combined stevia, because like there's like Truvia, which is not really just like pure stevia. So like I use stevia, I use monk fruit. For somebody who maybe has a lot of bacteria overgrowth, some of the sugar alcohols can be a bit more problematic because those are fermentable to gut bacteria. So if you are someone who has SIBO, those aren't great. Sucralose, in particular is one that I do see be a little bit more problematic. So a lot of the research they've done on sucralose is more based in mice. But also too, I will say this, most of the time where we see sucralose in a lot of those products, it's also in combination with a lot of other different artificial and fillers and gums. So when we pull out, foods that are high in sucralose, for example, like pre-workouts and protein powders and things like that, we do see improvement. Gums per se for people who has, let's say, a lot of bloating, xanthan gum, guar gum, not problematic. It's a prebiotic fiber, but for somebody who has a lot of bacteria overgrowth in their gut, that would be more problematic because it's feeding a lot of the bacteria. And actually, a lot of the studies they did using Xifaxan and neomycin, they would purposely give people 5 grams of guar gum to try to stir up the bacteria to make it more active, so it would be better treated with the antibiotics. So gums, emulsifiers are also an ingredient that's not so great for our gut bacteria. Alcohol for sure. Mainly like our gut lining, right? So alcohol does cause a breakdown to our gut lining. I mean, alcohol is not good for anything. There's some research, yes, red wine and polyphenols, and that can be beneficial, but it outweighs the
Yeah, even that.
yeah. And then vegetable oils and industrial seed oils. mainly due to their pro-inflammatory effect. And then, gluten's an interesting one because there's a lot of different arguments about, well, if you don't have celiac, should you go gluten-free? And I'd say more people have a gluten intolerance than we really are aware of. Just because a lot of the testing when it comes to gluten, it's only testing one component of gluten. And there's so many different components when it comes to wheat and gluten. And there's a good amount of research that does show gluten causing more so a breakdown in the gut lining. Not so much a lot of the bacterial overgrowth, but there can be more of that immune response and that breakdown of the gut lining.
Amazing. So foods that people should actually take more of.
Yeah, for gut health, I would say the 3 Ps. So prebiotics, probiotics, and polyphenols when it comes to carbohydrates. So prebiotics, those are going to be a lot of your high fiber foods. We can break those down into insoluble fiber, which you'll see insoluble fiber and things like artichokes. So artichokes are just great. I love artichokes. Artichokes, onions, we can see them oftentimes in like flax seeds, apples. These are good sources of insoluble fiber, but also resistant starches. So resistant starches, kind of like how they sound, they resist digestion in the gut, meaning like we don't break them down and absorb them, but the bacteria in our gut do. So we can get resistant starches from green banana flour. So sometimes I'll have my clients do like a teaspoon of green banana flour, throw it in their protein shake. Again, better for somebody who's working on gut health. So creating a very diverse microbiome, not trying to heal their gut, because resistant starches can still be a trigger for someone who has a lot of bloating and issues like that. But what the resistant starch does is they feed a lot of the bacteria in the large intestine, and they produce some of those short-chain fatty acids, in particular butyrate, which has a lot of those anti-inflammatory benefits and helps really build up that mucosal lining, has a lot of great metabolic effects. And then probiotics, right? We can get probiotics from food. We can also take it via supplementation. So fermented foods, sauerkraut, kimchi, miso, these would be great foods to add in. I always say start slow. People can really overdo. That's what I did too, like early on. I was like, the more fermented foods, the better. And I'm like, why am I more bloated? So start slow with some of the fermented foods. Probiotics are awesome. However, I've had different experts on my podcast too. I don't know if you know Dr. Kenneth Brown. And I've had some of the physicians from Dr. Ruscio, and there's still differing opinions about probiotics, right? So some of the theory is, probiotics don't actually adhere into the gut microbiome, meaning they don't colonize into the gut, but they do have a lot of transitory benefits. So they can still have benefits of what we talked about in terms of like the gut-brain connection and decreasing inflammation and helping with supporting the gut lining. So there's so many different strains that can be geared towards different things in the body, but they don't really actually colonize into the gut. However, spore-based probiotics have been shown to colonize more so in the gut. So when picking supplementation, it's just more so about the transitory benefit that we're going to get while taking these probiotics, spore-based probiotics, just because they have a little bit more of a defense mechanism from stomach acid, things like that throughout the body. Those can be taken for more colonizing effects in the gut. And then the last one would be those polyphenols. So all of the bright colored fruits and vegetables like we talked about earlier.
So it sounds like, try to avoid or try to get whole foods as much as possible and less of processed food, especially those with fillers and all these extra sweeteners, artificial sweeteners and all of that.
Yeah, it could be that simple, right? Just eat real whole food. We would be able to avoid a ton of issues. Like if I could just sum all of this up in one, it would be eat real whole food, unprocessed, unrefined, local and organic, high quality animal protein, ideally high in omega-3 fatty acids, fatty cuts of fish like salmon, things like that, grass-fed meat, that's awesome. Having more unsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. So avocados, olive oils, those are awesome too for supporting our gut biome. And then having just a very, high plant-based diet. I'm an advocate for a plant-based diet, but it's like plant-based with animal protein in it. That's the difference.
Yeah.
Some people, I am plant-based with animal protein, meaning my diet has definitely a good amount of plants and animal protein.
There you go. So that's the great summary of the advice. And we covered quite a lot today. We've covered, your background on what inspired you to go into the study of microbiome and gut health. And we've sort of broke down the differences between gut health and gut healing. And we looked at gut-brain axis and how gut microbiome affect mental health. And then we sort of talked about different types of advice and foods that people should and can take with themselves on a daily basis on how to improve gut health. So these are all great points. Now to wrap it up, I'm going to ask a more personal question. You are a super confident, successful speaker, coach, nutritionist, everything. You've got so many hats on. What was your biggest insecurity that motivated you to become the person that you are today?
Okay, so biggest insecurity that motivated me, right? And that's actually a spot on question and like how you frame it, because truth is I was pretty insecure, growing up.
We all are, right? Because we all have insecurities. No matter how perfect you see a person, you'll never know what they're going through. You never know whether they're happy or not. It's what you project is what you think they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I appreciate you say you seem super confident in speaking. I still get nervous speaking and doing podcasts and all of those different things. So I'm definitely not immune to still struggling with a lot of those different things, but I have overcome a lot. I'd say for me, so much of my worth for a lot of my upbringing really came from so much of the physical and the achievements, which really was coming from a place of lack of self-worth, right? My worth was coming from so many of these things outside of me. That's how I got praise when I was growing up. I got it for, dance and gymnastics and for fitness. I got it for my beauty, so I created this meaning of in order to have value, to have love, you have to be achieving, you have to be beautiful, you have to be strong, you have to be all of these things. So, it was from really an insecurity for a lot of my life. And it pushed me to achieve a lot physically in my body, achieve a lot in my career. And I've done a lot of the deep healing work about it, which is where, oftentimes when I do talks, it's not even on gut health. It's all just about healing and doing a lot of the deep inner work and the relationship that we have with ourselves. So for me, it's been a constant shift of the way I'm really relating to myself and the views that I have of myself, and healing the place I'm coming from, meaning that my sense of worth doesn't come from anything that's outside of me. And I also think too, for a lot of my upbringing, I went through a lot of my own trauma growing up, so I had a lot of anger. Anger is
really?
a powerful...
You seem so peaceful and zen. Really?
Oh, really? I love that you say that.
It's true, though.
I am now, but it's the deep parts, right? And sometimes anger is not always you see anger. It's a deep, just inner kind of feeling, and I wasn't even aware that it was there. And that's how a lot of these things are very unconscious, below awareness level. But if you think about it, anger is actually it's a very actionary emotion in a lot of ways. Depression, sadness, it's immobilizing. We don't do anything. We can't get out of bed. Anger, oh, you get shit done. You're doing stuff through a lot. So, I think I had a lot of anger growing up based off of my parents and my upbringing and what had happened to me unconsciously. So, healing has been, as I've healed that relationship and I've healed, a lot of the views of myself, It's allowed me to operate from a different place. And I think for a long time, I feared like losing my edge because it's a bit of an edge, right? You're like, ooh, I get shit done and make it happen and all this
Yeah.
stuff. But that's the biggest lie. And now I get to operate from more of, yeah, like the Zen place, more of like a calm confidence. It's a softer place. And I always say like soft, right? Soft can take a punch, but it's also like it's a soft, powerful energy instead of like a striving type of an energy.
Amazing answer. Thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing all the knowledge and sharing everything about you. I was very excited, looking forward to this interview ever since I spoke to you the first time, and you didn't disappoint.
Thank you for having me on. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it has been really, really fun. Thank you again, and I'll speak to you soon.